Today I want to share with you the top 10 foods to stock up on now for your prepper pantry before the prices go up or before they're out of stock. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferments, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning how to be a modern pioneer in the kitchen, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Now the first thing I want to say is if at any time you want to jump ahead, be sure to open up the description underneath this video where I'll have all the timestamps and I'll also put them in the pinned comment as well. Well, I know so many of us have been very concerned about stocking our pantries, not just the working pantry in our kitchen, but our extended pantry as well, what we nickname the prepper pantry. And our concerns have been based on the fact that we may have had to move some of our grocery monies to pay for gas, and also when we go to the grocery store, the money that we do have buys us less because of the inflationary times we're living through. So what I wanted to share with you today are the top 10 foods we really should be focusing on putting in our grocery carts every time we go to the grocery store. And these are foods that will allow us to make meals from scratch, but will also be budget friendly. And all of these foods are foods that we can keep in our working pantry as well as our prepper pantry because these are all non-perishable foods. And what I've done to help you with your shopping trips is I've created a downloadable. You can print this out or you can download it to your phone, whatever easiest for you, where I've listed the 10 foods that you want to try to always be putting into your shopping cart every time you do go grocery shopping. And then what I've done in this downloadable is I've listed columns for 4 weeks, and then I've given you a little example on how to fill this out. And basically what you want to do is do your inventory, see what I'm looking over at my own working pantry, see what you've got in your working pantry, see what you've got in your prepper pantry, and then you'll know how much you need to buy each week to get to a point where you feel well stocked. And so in week 1, you can write, okay, I need 2 cans of this or 2 packages of that, whatever the case may be, and whatever will fit within your grocery budget. And then week 2, week 3, week 4, and hopefully after about a month, you feel that you've pretty well stocked up, for at least the next couple of months. And then you can just print this out again, tack it up on your fridge, or as I said, download it to your phone and kind of start all over again. And just keep making sure that you're doing your inventory and keeping track of how much you have on hand so that you're never in a situation where you run out of food. And now if you need help with doing an inventory of your whole 4 corners pantry, which is your working pantry, your fridge, your freezer, and then your extended or prepper pantry, I do have a downloadable for that as well. And there's no email required. I want to make that clear. I want you to be able to just print this out easily and be able to print it out as much as you want, as well as to share it with your family and friends, because we all really have to be helping one another right now as we try to get through these inflationary times. Well, let's go over this list of foods now, but there's something that I want to just share with you in terms of helping you kind of have an open mind when you do go grocery shopping. And that has to do with something that I learned from my mother. My mom lived through the Great Depression of the 1930s and also the rationing of World War II. And she shared something with me that I thought was extremely interesting. We often hear, only buy what you eat, only buy what you eat, and that definitely makes sense. You want to buy foods that you and your family or your friends, whomever you're feeding, that you know that they like and that you like and that you're going to eat. However, there is something that you do need to keep in mind about all of this, and that you do need to have an open mind about. Sometimes the foods that you're used to eating and that the foods you know you like may be way too expensive for you, or maybe they're just simply out of stock. And something my mom shared with me that I thought was so interesting was she said that during the Depression, as well as the rationing of World War II, sometimes they simply could not get the foods that they were used to eating. So she shared with me that sometimes they had to try foods that they were not familiar with. And because that was basically all they could get, it wasn't just about keeping an open mind. In their case, it was often the only food that they could get. they had to try it and think of ways to prepare it, to make it tasty or whatever the case may be. And that was their food. And so they had to be willing to try different foods in order to avoid being hungry. And I think that right now we need to be and think like that as well. And I'll give you an example that I think is very cute. My mother is of Northern Italian heritage. And the food, what we know here in the United States, baked beans, which is very delicious, was not a food that was commonly prepared by my grandmother. But during the Depression, I guess my mother was saying that the only beans that were available to them were navy beans. And people in their community said, oh yes, you prepare them with molasses and onions. This was so foreign to my grandmother, and my mom was saying that she and her sisters thought it was so funny that people would take molasses and mix it with beans. And then when my grandmother made it and served it, they saw these brown beans floating in this brown liquid, and to them it was unappetizing. But she said once they all were willing to be open-minded and taste it, and they were hungry, that they loved them and they were delicious. And so I wanted to share that with you because we often hear, oh, I don't like this food or I don't like that food. And sometimes we need to be a little open-minded about it. And I know a lot of folks have told me that when we talk about buying canned fish, because it's very reasonable, that they'll share with me they don't like sardines. And I can totally understand that. If you didn't, I grew up eating sardines, but if you didn't grow up eating sardines, they can maybe appear to you a little off-putting. But when you learn to experiment with their preparation, I think you might find you actually like them. For example, I have a recipe where I show you how to make sardines in a way that I think is really tasty. And I love the fact that some of you said, well, I'm willing to try it, Mary. And you went ahead and you tried this recipe and you wrote me back and said, wow, I really like this and my family likes it. Who knew we liked sardines? So I think that's something that we kind of just need to be open to and be willing to try. And also something that's very important, especially in the traditional foods movement, especially as you transition from a processed foods kitchen where you buy a lot of prepared or packaged foods to a more traditional foods kitchen where you're making things homemade, but not just making them homemade, where you're preparing them properly. You may find that foods you thought didn't agree with you now do agree with you. And I have recipes where I show you how to properly prepare foods, especially beans and grains. We have not been properly preparing them in our modern society. And so in many cases, beans and grains will not agree with people. Now, certainly if you have diseases and conditions that don't allow you to eat those foods, that's totally understandable. But if it's just been something related to, oh, maybe I get a little indigestion or this, that, or the other thing, when you start preparing these foods properly, you find that you do actually, you are actually able to digest them. So these are all the things, excuse me, these are all the things you need to keep in mind. And I will definitely put links. I have a playlist to make it very easy for you, where I have recipes that I show you what I call like mastering the basics of, I think it's like traditional nutrient-dense foods cooking. And I show you how to soak and sprout beans, and it's so easy. And I show you how to soak and sour grains and how to make sourdough bread in an easy way. So there are a lot of things that you can learn how to do to make certain foods more digestible than maybe they were for you in the past. So I just say keep an open mind when you go to the grocery store. Look at what's in your budget and search out, not only on my site, I'll definitely put a whole bunch of links in the pinned comments to my various friends here on YouTube who also share a lot of homemade recipes, and I'm confident that you're going to find something that you're going to be able to make with maybe some new ingredients, and you're going to find that you really like them. Like how my mother discovered that as a child, she really liked baked beans, and she still loves them, and she makes them homemade on a relatively regular basis, did when I was growing up and well through her adulthood. So you never know what you're going to like when you start experimenting, making foods homemade. Okay. And you know me, I can go down rabbit trails, but I felt that that was important to share with you. And so the first item, so these are 10 items, and as I said, just buy what you can afford and try to put a few of these every week into your cart, or even more. If you can get all 10 in one sitting, that's fantastic. If not, don't worry about it. And just compare the prices to the smaller packages as well as the bulk packages. Because often, depending if there are store coupons or you have coupons that you've downloaded, a lot of grocery stores have online coupons, whatever the case may be, you want to compare the price per ounce to the smaller package as well as the bulk package to see where you're getting your best buy. Because sometimes the bulk isn't necessarily the best buy, but sometimes it is. And so that's something that you want to keep in mind. And I do want to share a little tip with you about buying in bulk. If for any reason there is a particular item that you like, maybe there's a particular type of rice you like, maybe like a basmati rice or a jasmine rice, and it's sold in 25-pound bags or 50-pound bags at some of the big box stores like your Costco's and your Sam's Club. If you can't afford the cost of that large amount, that large quantity of that particular item, at this time, because your money is very tight, something that you may want to think about doing is something that I used to do when I was in my big homeschool group. What we mothers would do, we would say, oh, I need X or I need Y, but I really can't afford just to buy this whole big thing in bulk. And so we would often do this on Saturday mornings, and because we would be cooking nutrient-dense foods and learning these different things, these different preparations of food. And we would say, okay, we'll all chip in and give the money to one person who may shop there at a particular store, and she would get the 50-pound bag or the 25-pound bag, and then we would divide it up and we would all kick in money that we had in our budget. And then it allowed us to buy rice or beans, or we used to do this with cod liver oil. The bottles, you could get a case, a lot less expensive than buying an individual bottle. And so we were always looking for ways to save money and to buy in bulk if it was less expensive per ounce, and to do this sort of like as a community. So definitely, if you have a social circle, talk with your friends and see, what do you like to buy and what do they like to buy, and might it be the same thing, and then you can both chip in so that neither of you are busting your budget. So definitely keep that in mind, and it's very appropriate to the first item on my list. I highly recommend that you consider buying beans. You can buy them dried and you can buy them canned. If you've seen my video on multiple streams of food where I talk about it's very important to have different types of foods in your pantry in different forms. So to have dried beans as well as canned beans, they serve different purposes. And so you never want to eliminate one possible stream of food. Beans are a very good source of protein, and they're relatively easy to prepare. And if they're properly prepared, as traditional cultures have been doing for thousands of years, you may find that you can digest them. And I'll put that link, on how to soak and brine beans and cook them sufficiently, or even take the next step where you soak and sprout them. But I think that for most people, as traditional cultures have been eating them for thousands of years, as I said, I think for most people they can be digestible without a lot of side effects. So definitely put dried beans on your list. Now, I know they're going up in price, and that's why I really wanted to address this, because this is the time now to try to stock up on them. Because from everything that we've been reading in the newspaper, it looks like come October of this year, 2022, we may see another fairly significant spike in the cost of real foods, because what we're seeing now is based on previous months' farmers' crops and so on and so forth. And what they're growing now with the cost and increase of fertilizer and this, that, and the other thing, and the shortages of truckers who can move the goods and the price of gas, with all of these prices increasing, our goods are going to be increasing. And so economists have been estimating that that may hit sometime around October. So it's a good thing now to start stocking up before those prices go up even farther, or are just out of stock, which are other things that I'm sure you've been reading in the newspaper with things going on in the world. We may really start to see shortages of grains and flours, things like that. So this is the time. Over the summer now, the weather is good, although very hot here in Texas, but we can get out, we can go shopping, we can buy these things and start stocking up now before prices increase in the fall, as well as before we run into the bad weather of the winter months. So beans, dried and canned. Next, number 2 is canned goods. And when I talk about canned goods, what I'm focusing on are tomatoes. Tomatoes are very important. They're wonderful meal extenders. And I have a video where I talk about the top 7 meal extenders that you want to be keeping in your pantry. I'll be sure to link to that video. That's very important. You want to make sure you have all 7 of those. And tomatoes is one of them, because they can really help you extend a meal. And they can be bulky and give body to soups and stews. They can be used as toppings. You can just do so much with canned tomatoes. So definitely, and there's such a wide variety. You can get the diced, you can get the whole, you can get them in the form of sauce. So there's a lot you can do. And then obviously the other canned goods that you want to start looking at are vegetables and fruits. Often the canned vegetables today, as well as the canned fruits, are of lovely high quality. And canned fruits especially are nice because many of them are canned in either water or their own juices, so you can avoid the syrups. If all you can find are fruits canned in syrup, try to find those that are canned in a sugar water solution as opposed to high fructose corn syrup. However, if all you can find are fruits canned in high fructose corn syrup, you can rinse it off best you can. High fructose corn syrup's a little hard on the liver, and so that's why we want to avoid it. And it's not a traditional food, so it's not something we want in our traditional foods kitchen. But one thing, I think if you've been with me a while, I'm not going to be a fuss budget and tell you can only buy this, that, and the other thing. I'm not going to worry about organic. I'm not going to worry about grass-fed. I'm not going to worry if the canned goods aren't perfect. We can make all of this work. Yes, is all of that great? Organic, grass-fed? Yes, all of that's wonderful. But right now, budgets are very tight, and we don't want to run out of food. And so buy what you can afford and make the best out of it, and just work with it. Don't worry what its status is in terms of, good, better, best. It's good enough, what is affordable in your budget, as long as it is a whole, real food. You're eons ahead, light years ahead of buying fast food or packaged food or prepared food. These things are going to be more expensive. They're going to have a lot of chemicals and preservatives in them, and we don't want them in our traditional foods kitchen. But don't worry if the whole foods that you can find, not the store, but the whole foods, the real foods that you can find may not be deemed, perfect. Don't worry about that. Buy what's in your budget and don't try to bust your budget. You're going to be, ahead of the game in the long run. And something I just want to take a minute to say here, and I'm going to do a video on this in the future, but I really want to make all of you feel better who right now simply can't afford organic food. And I know sometimes I get flack for this and people say, how can you say that? You just have to find the money, to buy organic food. But that's kind of hard right now when gas is $5 a gallon. Sometimes you got to have a little give and take, so to speak, in terms of what you're buying at the grocery store. But something I want to say about organic, because I think sometimes people don't realize this, that organic doesn't mean pesticide-free. There are just certain pesticides that are approved to be used on organic foods. They may call them organic pesticides, whatever the case may be. But organic doesn't mean pesticide-free. Big organic farms wouldn't be able to operate and grow food to the extent that they need to without various types of pesticides and fertilizers and so on and so forth. Yeah, may they be more natural and approved, at least here in the United States, like by the Food and Drug Administration, or I'm not sure exactly who approves these things, or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but whatever the case may be, everything has drawbacks, one way or the other. And many organizations now are telling people, even these organizations that are proponents of, grass-fed and organic and all of that, but many of them are saying, don't get too stressed out about that, because they found that people who had very tight budgets, and especially people who are lower income, were steering away from buying fresh fruits and vegetables when they could afford them, or even canned fruits and vegetables that weren't labeled organic. And now they couldn't afford the organic, but they were avoiding, whether it was fresh, frozen, or canned foods, and instead would wind up just buying some packaged food that had a lot of preservatives and ingredients and wasn't really natural. And they found that people were eating less real food. So this was very alarming. And so they came out and said, don't worry, even if it has pesticides, even if it's not organic, don't worry, you need to still eat fruits and vegetables. And, this now is so common. I'm sure many of you have already heard about this. There's the Clean 15, where you can that use the least amount of pesticides. They're not organic, but they use the least amount of pesticides, and so they're considered to be safe to consume. So if you're very concerned about it, that is something that you can definitely look at that list, and you can just search Clean 15 on the internet. So, but I just wanted to say that because I wanted to reassure many of you, buy fruits and vegetables in any form that you can, and regardless of whether they're organic or not. It's more important to buy real food than it is to buy packaged and processed foods. So, I'll get off my soapbox now. But in any event, so beans and canned goods. And now we want to talk about fats. Fats are very important because fats are foods that give you energy, and they're not something that you want to run out of. Now, for the working pantry and the prepper pantry, you want to be looking at shelf-stable foods. And those are things like ghee, coconut oil, and olive oil. Now, I know some of you like other oils, like avocado oil. That's fine too. I'm not really a fan of it. I've not been able to develop a taste for it. But the nice thing about ghee and coconut oil, and ghee, if you're not familiar with that, it's a type of clarified butter. It's where the milk solids have been removed, and so it makes it much more shelf-stable than butter. It's butter that's been melted down, the milk solids have been removed, and you're left with basically what you would think of as a butter oil. And clarified butter is where the milk solids are removed very quickly. Ghee is where the milk solids are allowed to toast a little and give the clarified butter a lovely flavor, and then it's called ghee. It's very common in Indian cooking, the country of India. And so ghee and coconut oil have very good shelf lives. And so they're wonderful to have as a non-perishable food for your working pantry and your extended or prepper pantry. Now, and they're also very natural foods, and they're very healthy. They're very rich in nutrients. And then the third one I have listed here is olive oil. Olive oil doesn't have as long a shelf life, but it's something that if you use olive oil, you want to be reminding yourself to make sure you have at least a 6-month supply on hand. And then probably every 6 months, you're going to need to buy some new, fresh olive oil. Some people will find their olive oil will last for a year if the bottle's not been opened. I have found that to be the case as well. But once I open my olive oil, and I do use a lot of olive oil, I find that it only really stays fresh in a dark bottle in my pantry, my working pantry, for about 6 months. And then you have to be careful, it may start to go rancid. But so start looking for ghee, coconut oil, and olive oil, and other oils that are shelf stable that you might like, but that are natural. Don't get your processed oils. Avoid your things like corn oil and sunflower oil and things like that. They're very processed. And they're also very high in something called omega-6, and we get plenty of that in our diet, at least here in the United States. We actually need more omega-3s, which are often found in like grass-fed beef and the butter from cows that have been grazed and fish like salmon and so on and so forth. But when you have ghee and coconut oil, if these are new to you, like what I talked about before, buy a small container first and start experimenting with it. And that's something I found with ghee. For a long time, I just couldn't really accept the taste of it. And the aroma was not something I liked. And as all of you here said to me, Mary, buy very small amounts and try different brands, and you will find a brand you like. And you all were so right. I found a brand that I liked, and now I use a lot of ghee in our kitchen. So definitely, start with small amounts, try them in your recipes, and see how you like them. And coconut oil can be very good for people who have to avoid dairy. So if you're looking for a shelf-stable fat, and coconut oil comes in different variations. Some is a little more processed than others, so it won't have the coconut aroma. But I actually like the coconut oil that does have the coconut aroma. It's good for certain recipes. So definitely be sure that you have a sufficient amount of good, high-quality fats in both your extended pantry as well as your everyday working pantry. So 1, beans, canned goods, tomatoes, vegetables, and fruits, and then fats, good quality, shelf-stable fats. Next, number 4 is milk. You want to have on hand some type of shelf-stable milk if you tolerate milk. And I'm specifically talking about dairy milk, real milk. If you don't tolerate dairy milk, then you want to look for your alternatives that are shelf-stable. Now, for shelf-stable milk, you want to look for powdered milk, and preferably one that may be low-temp dried. The lower it's dried at, the healthier it will be. Now, if you find powdered milk that's dried from whole milk, it will be shelf-stable for about 6 months in your working pantry or your prepper pantry. And the reason that it has a shorter shelf life than non-fat dairy powdered milk, which we'll talk about in a minute, is because it's whole milk and it contains the fat. And the fat is going to go rancid at some point. But the nice thing about having a whole milk, powdered milk on hand is it can make whole milk. And there's so much you can do with whole milk. Once you reconstitute it, you can turn it into evaporated milk if you want to be used in certain recipes. You can turn it into condensed milk, which is the sweetened condensed milk, to use in other recipes. Just having it as milk, you can culture it and make your homemade yogurt. From homemade yogurt, you can make yogurt cheese, and then take it even one step further to make a sort of mock homemade cream cheese. You can use your reconstituted whole milk to make cottage cheese. You can use your reconstituted homemade milk from powdered milk to make a mock ricotta cheese. There's just so much that you can do if you tolerate dairy and you want to keep powdered dairy on hand for emergencies. So definitely look for the variety of powdered milks that may be sold at your grocery store or online, and keep either the whole milk powdered milk, it's funny to say, or the non-fat powdered milk, which will have the longer shelf life, maybe a year or 2. So you may want to keep both on hand and just make sure that you are rotating them. Remember, with your working pantry and your extended pantry, first in, first out, because you never want to have food in the back that's expiring or going well past its best by date. Most foods are quite good, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, well past their best by date. So you don't need to really get wrapped up in that. However, over time, the quality and the nutritional value does start to degrade. So you want to keep that in mind and always be using the first in, first out system. And when things begin to run low on your working pantry, then go over to your extended or prepper pantry and go grocery shopping there, in essence, to restock your working pantry. And again, always with the first in, first out. So you're always using the foods that are closest to their best by date or closest to expiring, so that nothing goes bad, nothing degrades, nothing loses nutritional value. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about alternative milks. If you use oat milk or nut milks, all of this can be made homemade. You just need to make sure that in your working pantry or in your prepper pantry, you have what you need to make these items. So you're going to want to keep nuts on hand, and you're going to want to keep what's known as oat groats. That's the whole oat, because it's oat groats that are going to allow you to make truly nutritious oat milk that's not slimy. You have to start with oat groats. If you use the flaked oats, the old-fashioned rolled oats, you run into a few more problems. So be sure you have those ingredients. And if all's going well and you've got plenty of electricity and your fridge and freezer are working great, you can keep the nuts in the freezer to extend their life, because nuts contain oil and they're more likely to go rancid sooner than later. So you want to keep them as cold as possible for as long as possible to extend their life. If you do have to keep them in a working pantry or an extended prepper pantry, you really want to be checking. You want to seal them very well, and you want to keep them in a dark, cool place. And you do want to check on them relatively regularly to make sure that they have not gone rancid. And you want to catch them, within 3 to 6 months and use them before they would in fact go rancid. Oat groats, on the other hand, are very easy to store. You can put them in a big bucket, and you can store them. Many of whole grains, like oat groats or einkorn berries or spelt berries or wheat berries, these almost are often considered forever foods. Now, do they degrade in nutrition? Yes, of course. But you can store these in a way to really extend their shelf life. And oat groats could stay fresh maybe for as long as 8 to 10 years. Things like einkorn berries, spelt berries, many people will say they'll last for at least 25 years because they're in their whole form. They've not been ground into flour, which has a much shorter shelf life. So keep that in mind if you are one who uses alternative milks, to just make sure you have the ingredients on hand that you need to make the milks that you like, as opposed to buying them pre-prepared for you at the grocery store. And also something about that, if you are buying them pre-prepared, you really want to start thinking about making them homemade, because often the ones that are pre-prepared, this goes back to when I was talking about properly prepared foods. And sometimes these alternative milks have not been properly prepared. So if you have found that you bought some oat milk or nut milk and it didn't really agree with you, it's probably because it wasn't properly prepared. And when I say properly prepared, I'm not talking about that it's not clean or anything. The factories, they're preparing them in clean ways, but they may not be preparing them in traditional ways, the way traditional cultures have prepared their nuts and their grains, their seeds, so on and so forth. So definitely keep that in mind, that if you can learn to make these things homemade, you're going to be much better off in the long run, and just make sure that you stock your pantry with what you need. Number 5, nut butters. If peanut butter agrees with you, great. If you need some type of other nut butter, like almond butter, the cashew butter, there's such a huge variety today. Make sure you stock up on those, but again, with those, because they are nuts and they do contain fat, you do want to be conscious of the best by day and be very religious, so to speak, about first in, first out in your pantry. But nut butters are wonderful because they're like beans, they're high in protein, and they can be a wonderful food source if your chickens or your meats or your fish, the fresh foods, are low in supply or simply have become so expensive that it's very limited in terms of the amount that you can buy for your fridge and freezer. But having peanut butter can really help you extend your meal in many ways, and also it just makes a wonderful sandwich. But when you shop for nut butters, try to find those that have the simplest amount of ingredients as possible. Basically, you want it to say roasted nuts and maybe some sea salt, and that's it. Some of your fancier brands, but I think they have also become rather expensive, but some of the fancier brands may contain honey, may contain some maple syrup. That's okay, especially if you like having that little bit of sweetness in your nut butters. But try to avoid buying those that contain sugar or high fructose corn syrup. Try to find as simple a nut butter as possible. Number 6, my personal favorite, being of Italian heritage, pasta. You can never go wrong with buying pasta. But what you want to look for is in the ingredients, you want to make sure the pasta you're buying is made from durum semolina wheat. And this is why I always say it can be so much better to actually buy pasta at the grocery store than to make it homemade if, when you're making it homemade, you're just using all-purpose flour. If you make it homemade, you want to use semolina flour, but sometimes that can be hard for people to find depending on where you live. But pasta is very reasonable, it's a meal extender, and semolina is actually very nutritious. Semolina is not white flour. When durum wheat is ground into flour, it can be whole durum wheat flour, but more commonly it's sifted to make a durum flour that has, like, the bran and the germ, things like that, sifted out of it. And something that is also sifted out and left behind is referred to as the semolina middlings, or just middlings. But these durum flour middlings are very nutritious, and so those are used to make pasta. So never feel bad about serving pasta. It's very affordable, and you can even further boost the nutrition of the semolina flour by using some of your canned tomatoes, some of your canned vegetables. Maybe you've got canned chicken. Having canned meats on hand is wonderful, and you can make a wonderful, nutritious meal. Plus, if you serve any meal, keep this in mind, and this is very important. I know that maybe those of you who've been with me for a while know that I kind of beat this drum a lot, but it's very true. You can boost the nutrition, specifically the protein, of any meal where maybe you only have a little bit of protein in that meal. You can boost the protein by serving bone broth with that meal. Maybe you start with a little bone broth soup, or maybe you just serve bone broth in a mug. My family has drank it like that for years with a little bit of sea salt in it. Bone broth is very high in protein. It's also known as what's called a protein sparer. And what this means is it allows you to absorb every little last bit of protein out of any food that you're eating that contains some protein. And it does a lot of other things as well, but that's one of the things that makes bone broth so special. And if you have a chicken, you have a whole chicken, and you roast that chicken, you serve it as a meal, save that carcass, throw in some vegetable scraps. It can be carrot peelings, onion skins. They all have wonderful nutrition. You make a bone broth, and you serve that with any meal where you feel you've really had to stretch the protein, and you may not have a lot of protein in that meal, and you're feeding growing children, teenagers, and you really want to boost that protein, serve it with bone broth. And it's really going to help add considerable protein to your meal. And speaking of bone broth, did you know you don't need to buy all those fancy collagen powders and bone broth powders and whatever it is they sell today that's really expensive? all you need to do is make bone broth and drink bone broth. You can add bone broth to your smoothies. You can even dehydrate bone broth, and you don't even need a dehydrator. You can do it in your oven. You just spread it out in a pan that has a rim, but that you spread it out kind of thin. It dries. It looks like stained glass. You can break it up into shards, or you can even run it in one of those little coffee grinders or a blender, and you make your own bone broth powder. And then you can take, if you work outside the home, you can take it with you, add hot water. You have a nice bone broth, in essence, that you can travel with. So there's so much that you can do when you learn how to make things homemade, and you learn how to properly prepare foods and make them homemade in a way that provides so much versatility. And as I've often said, bone broth is the backbone of the traditional foods kitchen. And don't worry about beef bone broth. If you beef bones are getting expensive, and it's unfortunate, but right now it is what it is. But as long as we can still find some chicken that is affordable, and we just make what I call roast chicken bone broth. You're just using the scraps from a roast chicken. That literally can be made for pennies. And yes, you have the cost of the chicken, but hopefully you've been able to get a few meals out of that. And so you can literally make chicken bone broth for pennies. And if you say, oh my gosh, I'm at the point where I can't even buy a whole chicken, things have gotten so expensive. Let me tell you, fish bone broth to the rescue. Fish bone broth is very mild. It doesn't have a fishy flavor. It's actually very pleasant. And you can do what I've done. You go to your fishmonger and you tell him, I need the carcass of a fish. And you want to make sure you've got the head and the tail and then the carcass. And I did this. You can even go to the fancy specialty grocery stores. I went to Whole Foods one day with my husband, and I said to the fishmonger, oh, I'd like to make fish bone broth. And I didn't really want to have to buy the whole fish because it was expensive. And so I said, I'd like to make fish bone broth, and really all I need, is the carcass of the fish. And he was so nice. He said to me, oh, don't worry about that. You don't have to buy the whole fish. I'm filleting these fish, and when I'm done filleting them, I'll give you the carcass. Now, a lot of states have different rules. They can't always kind of just give you something free like that. But he basically marked the package, I think it was $2. And I'll link to that fish bone broth if you want to learn. It's so easy. The nice thing is fish bone broth is really just like a fish stock. It only takes 45 minutes to make. You do it on the stovetop, you throw in some veggies, and you basically, and you don't even need the carcass of any expensive fish. You just need the carcass of a plain, simple white fish, because the carcass of the more expensive fish, like your salmons and whatnot, they're high in fat, and you want to prevent the development of rancidity in your fish stock. So your fattier fishes don't always work well for this process. So if you see filet of sole, or a sole, like a trout, different fishes like that. And if you go early in the morning, because that's usually when they'll get their deliveries and they'll start filleting the fish, if you have a store where there's an actual fishmonger and he's actually filleting fish, versus certain grocery stores just get the fish delivered already filleted for them. But some of your higher end grocery stores actually do the filleting in the back, and just ask them. And maybe you live in an area where they can just give you a bag of it for free. But at most, hopefully they're just going to charge you a few dollars. And fish bone broth is wonderful, very rich in collagen, which is a protein, so it's very rich in protein. And most fish stock is rich in iodine, and so it can be very helpful to keeping our thyroids healthy, because our thyroids like iodine. But in any event, so load up on your pasta. Don't worry about that. It's at least for the time being. I have seen it's been inching up in price. On my first Walmart haul, it was about 82 cents a pound. And when I went back, it had popped up to 92 cents a pound. So they are creeping up in price. But just make sure you look. And most pastas are made from durum semolina. So chances are you're going to be in good shape there. So just get a variety of shapes, and try to think about including a pasta meal maybe once or twice a week into your recipe routines throughout the week, and it can be a real money saver. And sometimes if you find that you're enjoying canned fish, there is the most simple recipe that you can make that is very delicious and it's very tasty, and all you need is some spaghetti, a little bit of olive oil, and a couple of anchovies. And you cook the anchovies in the olive oil and they'll basically disintegrate. There's no fishy taste, and you can toss your pasta in that, and that's a delicious and simple meal. And you're incorporating the wonderful omega-3s from the sardines, and then you have maybe a side of fish bone broth, and you have a wonderful meal. Number 7, I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anyone since I mentioned beans, but number 7 is rice. And any type of white rice that you like is fine. I really have enjoyed buying the basmati rice. You can buy the jasmine rice, you can buy the long grain rice, the short grain rice. Whatever type of rice that you want is a wonderful thing as a meal extender as well, to keep in your working pantry as well as your extended pantry. And the reason you might say, Mary, why are you mentioning white rice? You can certainly buy brown rice, but what you need to keep in mind is that brown rice is going to have a much shorter shelf life because it does have the bran intact and it's got the oils intact, and so that is more inclined to go rancid quicker than white rice that has had that removed. But don't worry about buying white rice, because we're going to talk about how you can really improve the nutrition of it. And what's important is that it has a very long shelf life. And I have a video where I go over all the different ways to store food to extend its shelf life, and I'll be sure to link to that. I have a whole series where I go over everything, all the different types of storage vessels, what's the difference between a silica gel pack and an oxygen absorber, how to use Mylar bags. I have the whole thing in a playlist for you, so I'm not going to leave you high and dry. I'm going to show you how to store all of this and to extend its shelf life as long as possible so that you make the most out of your grocery budget. But what I want to say about white rice is white rice can be a wonderful vehicle for getting other types of nutrients into your own diet or your family's diet. You can cook your white rice in your chicken bone broth. And if you have beef bone broth, that's great too. You can use any bone broth, fish bone broth. You can cook your rice in place of using water, use your bone broth. So now you've infused your rice with protein. And you can add some butter and some sea salt. So now you've added a good fat and you've added some minerals via the sea salt. So you've made that rice a wonderful vehicle of nutrition. You've added protein, you've added a good fat, butter. Even when it doesn't come from the best milk, from the best cows, it's still very nutritious. And you've added the minerals from the sea salt. So you've made something that now is nutritious and that now is a wonderful vehicle if you're little by little introducing these foods to your family, like bone broth. Rice can be a wonderful way to use that as a very familiar food, but maybe making it with some ingredients that are less familiar and that are new to you as you move farther along your journey. What I call the traditional foods kitchen continuum, as you move farther along on your journey. And then you can add some chopped vegetables, you can do a fried rice, you can add, by adding in like a little scrambled egg. There's just a lot that you can do with rice. And the white rice, having the wonderful shelf life, can be very helpful to stock up on. Yes, if you like brown rice, get that. Just keep in mind, first in, first out, because that's going to have a shorter shelf life. And then, of course, if you've got your beans and you've got your rice, now you can make rice and beans. And there's so many ways that you can make rice and beans. There's so many recipes on the internet, and they can be very tasty and very delicious. And I highly recommend that you start looking at some different recipes on the internet and you start experimenting. And I think you're going to be surprised how tasty rice and beans can be. And I have something cute I want to tell you, that there's also a lot of cookbooks, that talk about rice and beans recipes. And I think some of the best ones come from people who are sharing recipes out of Louisiana. And I have a girlfriend who's originally from Louisiana, and she gave me this cute little, it's only about this big, cute little cookbook, and it's just filled with these wonderful Louisiana rice and bean recipes. So definitely keep your eyes open for cookbooks or online sites that address recipes using those ingredients. And then when you make your rice and beans, in place of water, just use your bone broth. And so when you're cooking your rice, so there's so much you can do to stay within your grocery budget, yet still provide a lot of good nutrition for yourself and your family and your friends. Now, number 8, salt. Now, I want to talk about salt because this is very important. Yes, you need salt, especially when you do home baking. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But it also brings lovely flavor to food, and sea salt brings a lot of good minerals to the table. But all of that said, you want to make sure that you keep some iodized salt on hand. Now, that salt does often have potentially other chemicals in it and anti-caking agents, so it's not the type of salt that you want to use when you're making your ferments. When you make ferments, you want to use a very plain, basic salt that's just salt. It could be like the wet gray salt from France. It could be the real salt, which I believe is from Utah here in the United States. It could be canning and pickling salt, which I believe is just salt. Kosher salt, you have to really check the ingredients, because I've noticed that a number of kosher salts are no longer just saying salt. Sometimes they are containing some anti-caking agents and things like that. So you got to be a little careful with that. But you can also find sea salt. Now, basically, yes, are all salts sea salts? Were they all from the sea at one time? Yes. And there are different brands of sea salt that also contain iodine, or they've added the iodine in. And they're very reasonable. And they're made by pretty much all the big salt manufacturers, as well as some of your fancier boutique salt people. But you want to have that iodized salt on hand, because we never know what the future holds. Things are, not only very expensive, we have some instability, not only in our own country here, I speak for the United States, but around the world. You never know what the future holds. But the more prepared you are, the better you might be able to sleep at night. And we don't know if we might be in a situation, especially those of us who don't live on various coasts, where you're not near the ocean. And you never know if you may not be able to get fish, which is what's high in iodine. And if that were to present a problem, you at least would have your iodized salt. And how salt came to be iodized was many years ago, before we had the ability to transport food so easily here and there. People, at least here in the United States, and those of you who live in other countries may have similar stories or experiences, people who lived in the interior of the United States were developing goiter, and that's where the thyroid becomes enlarged, because they didn't have sufficient iodine in their diet. So the government of the United States started iodizing salt, because everybody did have salt, and salt was easy to ship. And then they were able to avoid the development of goiter, because the thyroid plays a very important role in regulating a lot of things in our body, and so we want to keep it as healthy as possible. So yes, you can have your sea salt, your real salt, your French salt, whatever salts you like having on hand to season your foods, as well as to use for when you make your ferments, your fermentation, your vegetable ferments. You also want to make sure you've got a couple of containers of iodized salt. I personally try to keep 6 of those little round tubs. I think the brand that my grocery store sells might be Morton's. I'm not sure. It's one of the main salt brands. And I keep about 6 of those little round tubs, the way the salt is sold, and it says iodized sea salt. And I just keep that, for emergencies. Next, I want to talk about sugar. Now, generally, I'm not a fan of keeping a lot of white sugar on hand. I think that it can come in handy if you like to make some homemade jams or jellies. But generally, even if I keep white sugar on hand to make a jam, I'm going to do a low sugar jam. And I generally will wind up using other types of whole sugars as opposed to white sugar. But I know not everybody, when I make a jam, but I know not everybody likes to do that. They really do like to just have the pure, clear color of that the white sugar imparts or actually doesn't impart, as opposed to your whole sugars. So that is something that you want to think about keeping in your prepper pantry or your everyday working pantry if you want to be able to use something, a sweetener, a white sugar, where you're not looking for, or you're trying to avoid the color imparted by your whole sugars. However, I'm not going to tell you just to keep white sugar on hand. When it comes to sweeteners, as you move farther down on your journey in your traditional foods kitchen, you really want to be stocking in your working pantry and your prepper pantry your whole sugars. The first place to start is with something like Sucanat, and some brand, that's a brand name, and all it stands for, they just took the letters out of the words sugar cane natural. And basically what Sucanat is dried whole sugarcane juice. It's like the original brown sugar. They didn't extract the molasses and then put it back in and have white sugar and all. They just took the sugarcane juice and they dried it. And what's nice about Sucanat is that it has all of the minerals intact. So as you work further down on your traditional foods journey, you really want to start incorporating these whole sugars. Now, a lot of people are starting to incorporate Sucanat into their traditional foods kitchens, and a lot of people are on this journey moving to a traditional foods kitchen. And it really, it kind of all started with Sally Fallon's book, Nourishing Traditions. There was this movement, first there was kind of the slow food movement, then Sally came out with her book, and people really started getting very interested in how traditional cultures cooked foods and prepared foods properly, and that was about 20 or so years ago. And then it's as though things really exploded in 2020. And people became very interested in how to make things homemade and how to properly prepare foods. And so, at least in my case, I noticed that Sucanat was getting really hard to find at the grocery store. So, and my grocery store does carry it. More grocery stores are carrying it because they see how popular it's becoming, that people want to use this real whole sugar. So I highly recommend that if you find that in stock and the price is in your budget, to consider carrying that and stocking that in your pantry. And again, if you can find it in bulk, think about going in with other people and buying it in bulk if the price per ounce comes down considerably, and then just store it appropriately. As I said, I have a lot of videos on how to store food properly. Next, you can also think about honey. Honey is very affordable. It's very easy to come by, and you want to look preferably for raw honey. Now, if you're going to use honey to do a lot of baking, getting it raw is not as important. But if you're going to use your honey to drizzle over maybe yogurt and fruit, or to take as a medicinal for medicinal purposes, or to simply use in some fashion where it's not going to be heated, you really do want to look for your raw honeys. And if in the case of raw honeys, you can find honey that's local, that may be sold by a farmer who has bees, I highly recommend that, because that's going to have all of the pollens and whatnot that are in the area in which you live. And a lot of people believe that taking a little bit of honey every day, a local honey, can help you cope with overcoming seasonal allergies if you have that problem. So definitely think about stocking sucanat and honey. And then finally, if you can find this in an affordable, not finally, but if you can find this in an affordable source, and again, maybe buying a case and breaking that case up with friends, is maple syrup. Maple syrup is also very nutritious, and the interesting thing about maple syrup is that if you follow the diet that likes to limit the level of the glycemic index in foods, and you like to eat foods that are low on the glycemic index, which means they have less impact on the blood sugar in your body, maple syrup is low on the glycemic index. So that's something to think about. And you can usually find it fairly affordably at some of the big box stores. But again, if it's at your grocery store and it's really pricey, because again, keep in mind, you're looking for maple syrup, real maple syrup. You're not looking for a pancake syrup or things like that, or that are just made either from sugar and coloring or high fructose syrup and artificial coloring. You're looking for real maple syrup. And when you look for real maple syrup, I like to look, today they used to say grade A and grade B. Now they just say grade A, but I think they have the designation amber and dark. You want to get the dark, and it's often less expensive because that has more nutrition. So the flavor is a little stronger, but it's also more nutritious. And you could even talk to your grocery store if you don't have big box stores in your area that carry maple syrup, where you're able to get a larger container for a more reasonable price per ounce. You can talk to your grocery store to see what they would charge you for a case, and then go in with some of your other friends who may be wanting to think about stocking maple syrup. So sucanat and honey, maple syrup, these are all wonderful sweeteners, whole sweeteners to keep on hand. Plus, the shelf life, they're basically forever foods. These never go bad. Once you open maple syrup, it should be refrigerated because it has a higher water content. But honey and the sucanat, they don't need to be refrigerated once they're opened. And they have a very long shelf life, and many people will call them forever foods. So definitely look into stocking up on those now while you can still afford them and while they're still in stock. Now, other sweeteners to look into, date sugar as well as date syrup. That's very nutritious and has a wonderful shelf life. And now it's interesting on date sugar. It's becoming more popular, and I am sometimes seeing that at my grocery store, and it'll often sell out very quickly. But you can also find that online. But so think about things like that, date syrup and date sugar. And I think there's a company, I think she just calls herself the Date Lady, maybe, I'm not sure. But they make a whole line of date sweeteners. So just research that online and see what you can find, see what's in your budget. But date syrup, it's in many ways very similar to molasses, but a little milder in flavor. And date sugar, I've experimented with that when I've been able to find it, and it works very well. It's a very good replacement for sucanat. Now, talking about replacements, there is something called maple sugar, which could be a replacement for your maple syrup. It's just simply maple syrup that's been dried, but maple sugar has gotten very expensive. So if you find it and it's a good bargain, it's definitely worth stocking up on, because that basically, like sucanat and some of your other whole sugars that are dried, has a very long shelf life, different than the maple syrup because all that water has been extracted out of it. So that's definitely something to look for. And maple sugar really doesn't have a strong maple flavor taste. And when I've showed you how to make some of your homemade cake mixes and things like that, I've talked about how maple sugar works very well in place of white sugar when making your own homemade yellow cake mixes, because the color is very light, and so it doesn't create a darker yellow cake once you bake up with it. And personally, I don't notice the maple flavor. So that's something worth experimenting with and maybe introducing into your traditional foods kitchen. If right now, hopefully maybe in the future the price will go down, but I have seen the price really inch up quite a bit. And it's not something that I feel, in my humble opinion, is affordable in a small package. I feel the price is quite high per ounce in a small package. So you really need to look for larger packages of maple sugar, or see if you can buy a case of some sort of larger containers of it. But buying a case brings the per ounce amount down, and then divide that up amongst your friends who may want to also stock maple sugar. Now, I want to talk about molasses. Molasses is a wonderful syrup to keep on hand. This is simply all of the nutrients, basically, that have been extracted out of the sugarcane juice when they go through the process of drying it and then ultimately creating white sugar. So molasses is so rich in nutrients, plus it's high in iron. And I will tell you, when I was a little girl, my mother always put maybe a teaspoon or a tablespoon of molasses in milk and would have me drink that every day, because molasses is very high in iron. And often you hear, from pediatricians that children always need to make sure that they're getting plenty of iron so that they grow normal and they grow normally and develop properly, and so on and so forth. And so molasses can be a wonderful way to bring that iron into your kitchen that you may need if you're having to cut back on foods that naturally contain iron, which are often, animal foods that can be more expensive. Now, molasses does have a stronger flavor. I mean, I got used to it as a kid. I don't remember really making any face about it. My mother would use a lot of molasses, and it was because it was a reasonable source of sweetener, and she knew it was very rich in iron. And she had grown to love it back from the Great Depression with the baked beans. So she always had a lot of molasses on hand, and it is very affordable. And you can bake with molasses. It brings a wonderful rich flavor into your baked goods. And little by little, introducing the flavor to yourself or to your family and friends. If it's not something that you've used, you can mix a little bit of it with water to dilute it a little, and then maybe drizzle it over some oatmeal if you have your oat groats. And I show you how to make real old-fashioned oatmeal using oat groats. And then you put some canned fruit, maybe put a little drizzle you can mix it with a little vanilla flavoring, vanilla extract, and kind of just drizzle a little bit until your palate gets adjusted to these new flavors, the flavors of the molasses or even other whole sweeteners that you use. Well, now we've reached number 10, and number 10 is wheat products and whole grains. In the news, we've been hearing a lot of rumblings about the fact that there may be shortages in wheat products. So when we are at the grocery store and they are available to us and they meet our budget, we definitely want to think about putting those types of things in our cart. Specifically, you want to look at all-purpose flour and or bread flour. Now, these are both what are called white flours or plain flours, in that all of the bran and the germ has been sifted out of them. However, they do have a relatively long shelf life. Generally, all-purpose or bread flour can stay fresh about 2 years. Some people have said even longer. Sometimes longer. It can take on a little bit of almost like a musty flavor, but if you store it really well, you may be able to extend it past those 2 years. Now you might be saying, oh, but white flour is not nutritious and whatnot. However, you can use your all-purpose flour or your bread flour to make a sourdough starter and then to make sourdough bread. And the souring process of making sourdough bread changes the flour and actually does make it brings nutrition back into the flour, even through the baking process, and makes it more digestible for the human digestive system. So definitely think about stocking up all-purpose and or bread flour. Bread flour simply has a little bit higher protein than all-purpose flour, but either one that you can find and that's available to you and that is in your grocery budget, be sure to start stocking up on that. And if you've never made a sourdough starter and you've never made sourdough bread, don't worry. I have a whole playlist where I show you how to make a sourdough starter and make sourdough bread and how to troubleshoot any kind of problems that you might be experiencing with your sourdough starter. So it's definitely something you can learn. It's not hard. There's a little trial and error, a little practice, but you can become very good at making sourdough bread right in your own kitchen. And even if you're making things like quick breads or biscuits, you can increase the nutrition by using good quality whole fats, like we talked about earlier. Fats was number 3. You can use some ghee. You can basically make biscuits from everything you have in your working or extended pantry. You can use non-perishable items to make biscuits and improve the nutrition because you're not using something like a processed fat that comes in a can and is white and is just hydrogenated and not good for you. You can take your all-purpose flour, you can use some ghee, and you can reconstitute some of your powdered milk, and you basically have everything you need with a little bit of salt, a little bit of baking powder, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and you can make biscuits, and they can be relatively nutritious. Now, what about whole grain flours, whole wheat flour, for example, which is very common at the grocery store? You can certainly buy whole wheat flour or other whole grain flours, but again, you have to be very conscious of the best by date. And you have to be very conscious of always rotating these types of flours, whether they're in your working pantry or your extended pantry, with that first in, first out system. And the reason is whole grain flours have all the bran and germ intact, and so all the oils are intact. And oils, what? They go rancid. So whole grain flours can go rancid quicker than all-purpose or bread flours. So if you buy whole grain flours, always have that in the back of your mind that they're probably going to stay fresh. Even when you store them really well, they're probably only going to stay fresh for somewhere from 6 months to maybe 1 year. A lot of people will say up to 1 year. But I'm kind of a believer of if you can use your whole grain flours within 6 months, all the better. Now, what about whole grains? Now that's the direction you want to go into. I alluded to this a little bit earlier in this video, but if you can buy whole grains and buy them in bulk and store them appropriately, whether it's just your modern whole, the wheat berries, you're actually talking about the whole grain, they're often referred to as berries, but they look like grains. You can certainly stock modern day whole wheat berries. There's also white whole wheat berries that can bake up a little bit of a lighter bread. I like to personally stock a whole einkorn berries and whole spelt berries and whole rye berries, or some people call them rye groats. They have very long shelf life. And then you need to keep in mind that if you're going to buy whole grains, what are you going to do with them? How do you turn them into flour? And that's when you're going to want to look for a grain mill. You can have a manual grain mill, which is wonderful because you make sure you use a little bit of your own energy, get a little exercise, or you can use an electric grain mill. Now, if you use a manual grain mill, I highly recommend getting the flywheel rather than just having the handle. The flywheel does make the job a lot easier. And most of these manual grain mills are relatively affordable. And I have a video where I show you the different ways you can take whole grain and turn it into flour. You can even use a high-powered blender. If you have one of those fancy high-powered blenders, you can use that to turn whole grain into flour. Some do require that you have a particular type of container to do that, but that is an option. It's something my girlfriend does. She'll freeze her grain so it stays nice and cold and doesn't get overheated and potentially cause the oils in the whole grains to go rancid. And she'll just grind them in a Vitamix type grinder with the special container that they recommend that you use. So that's definitely something to consider. Personally, for me, I did a lot of research. I've shared this with you many times. I've done a lot of research on grain mills, and the one that I settled on was the Mock Mill. And it's very affordable. It's in like around the $300 range. Unfortunately, it did go up in price a few months back, but it's still quite affordable. And it's a stone grinding mill, so it protects the oils in your grain. And I love that thing. It's relatively quiet. It's very easy to use. I have the smaller one, the 100, which is perfect for my size family. And the people at Mock Mill are so nice. Now, I bought my Mock Mill. I did a lot of research and bought it and paid for it myself, and I liked it so much that I contacted the people at Mock Mill, and they were so kind to give me a discount code that I can pass on to my viewers. So if you are in the market for a grain mill and you do your research and you decide that the one you want is a Mock Mill, be sure to click on the link that I have below, which will take you over to my website where I have a lot of discount codes for you on a lot of different traditional food type products and services and appliances and whatnot. But that one for Mock Mill is great. Now, keep in mind, the Mock Mill is extremely popular. And it's become really popular going back to 2020 when everybody wanted to grind their own grain and learn how to make homemade bread. But if you put your order in, yes, they are back ordered, but if you put your order in, if it's something you really want, you do get sort of on their waiting list in the order in which you put your order in. So when they do get more in stock, then it's first come, first serve. So that's a good thing to know. It's a little frustrating when you have to wait, but at least you can kind of get in the queue, and be sure to use the discount because that can help you save, a couple of bucks, which is something we all need to do these days. And Mock Mills also come out with a flaker, and I have videos where I show you where I share with you my unboxing of the Mock Mill, and also the unboxing of the new device that they recently released, the flaker, which if you like making muesli and using a lot of flaked grain, this thing is fantastic. I was very impressed with it. And I bought it myself, paid for it myself, but you could use the discount code for that too. And it's really quiet and it works great. I was very impressed. And it'll flake all these different grains. And then you can use them, like you'd use any kind of rolled old-fashioned oats. You can use them to make meal extenders, the way I like to use rolled old-fashioned oats, muesli, granola bars. There's really so many purposes, and yet you can be introducing all these different types of nutrition. I've never even seen einkorn rolled oats, or not rolled oats, but rolled einkorn or einkorn flakes. It's very impressive. And it's very nutritious because it's just taking the whole grain and flaking it. It's not going through any kind of boiling or softening process where some of the nutrition may be extracted. So yeah, I like the Mock Mill Company. They have a lot of interesting things that they sell. They also sell a lot of whole grain, the ancient grains like einkorn and spelt. I'll link to my website where you can see the discount code, and also link to their website so you can see everything they have. I find it a lot of fun. So definitely think about the different types of flours you can buy, as well as the different type of whole grains you can buy. And the nice thing about whole grains, and especially ancient grains, a lot of these are sold in bulk. And again, this is where you can go in with your friends. If it's too much, and grains have really been inching up in price. I've just been shocked. And I don't see any, relief in sight, at least, in the near future. So it's something we want to try to buy now and stock up on. So if the bulk price per ounce is less than what you can buy in smaller packages, and often with whole grain it is, that's something definitely to consider going in with your girlfriends. Or your men friends, whatever. I know both men and women watch his channel. I think of as girlfriends, but definitely in your social circle, think about buying these things together and then dividing them up. It's a wonderful way to get started. And also, if these grains are new to you, it's a wonderful way for you maybe to buy a smaller amount and try them out. Now, what if you want to buy whole grains because from the nutritional value, but you don't have any way to turn your whole grain into flour. Don't worry. You can use your whole grains to actually cook and cook them up like a side dish, very similar to how you would make to make rice or barley if you've cooked whole barley. Einkorn can be cooked up as a side dish and put butter and some sea salt, and it's wonderful. So there's a lot that you can do with whole grains. They're very nutritious. They're high in protein. Again, these are the type of things that are non-perishable. And the reason that I'm kind of focusing today on the non-perishables is because we never know in terms of electricity. You know, in 2021, we went through, you know, some massive ice and snowstorms. It's so unpredictable. But it's always very important to have things that you can feed yourself and your family that don't require refrigeration or freezing. And if you want information on how to put together what I call like a 2-week emergency pantry, which is an area that you can carve out on the shelves of your extended or prepper pantry, where you stock foods that can be prepared without fresh water and with fresh running water and without electricity. And I have that video, and it comes with a checklist and a meal plan. See, that's very important. So you can download that. You can watch that video where I go over everything, and then you can download the shopping list. You can buy those things, just put them in like maybe a box or something, and then you can also download and print out, or download it to your phone, whatever works for you, or print it out, and keep that with, if you have the actual paper copy, keep that meal plan with that box of 2-week emergency survival or emergency food, because that meal plan walks you through how to use everything that I've suggested that you buy on that shopping list. So I go through breakfast, lunch, and dinner and snacks for 7 days. And then you can just start at the beginning again and repeat for another week. And hopefully we won't be in an emergency or survival situation for more than 2 weeks. But at least you know you've got your survival pantry and your survival pantry foods, and you've got your meal plan. So you're not going to be left without something to eat, and maybe in a situation where you can't even get out of your house because of bad weather. This way you're not going to run out of food. Now, while we're on wheat products, our flours and our whole grains, some other things that I want to stress is that always think, okay, I'm going to be making homemade bread, whether it's a yeast risen bread, whether it's a sourdough bread, whether it's a quick bread, what am I going to need? And so think about what I've written down here on the list is think about when you're shopping for your wheat products or your whole grain products, think about including packaged yeast, baking powder, baking soda, and another ingredient which may be a little new to you and something that you're not familiar with, but it's called barley malt. Now, if you buy unhulled barley and you soak it and sprout it and then grind it into a flour, that's a barley malt. Barley malt is basically sprouted barley. And the reason why I recommend having some barley malt on hand is because it can be a wonderful addition whenever you're making a yeasted bread or a sourdough bread to help with making a nice consistency to your bread. And you don't need a lot. You can buy a little package of barley malt because you're only going to be using anywhere from a teaspoon to a tablespoon. But that's something that's, I think you're going to find very helpful to keep on hand if you start making your own baked goods. And when you get very far down on your traditional foods journey, as I explained in the beginning about barley malt, you can start making your own. Now, one other item that I want to mention in terms of the baking products, and this is for people who do not have a sensitivity to gluten, but you can actually buy gluten. It's a wheat protein. And when you bake with ancient grains, especially einkorn, einkorn's very low in gluten. Now, if you're completely gluten intolerant because you have a particular disease, then no, you can't eat these type of breads. But if you've just maybe had some trouble digesting bread or whatnot, again, a lot of it goes to the fact that it's probably not been properly prepared. But if you, through like soaking or sprouting, souring, these type of ways of properly preparing grains in order to use them to make breads that then are better assimilated by our bodies and allow us to digest them better. But if you do not have any sensitivity to gluten, I highly recommend keeping some gluten on hand because, as I said, it is high in protein. In Japan, they eat gluten, because it is a protein-rich food, wheat gluten. And you can use that to add a little extra, and you don't need to buy a lot because you're only going to be using, it's like barley malt, maybe a teaspoon to a tablespoon. But you can add that to some of your ancient grains, especially einkorn, to get a little better rise out of your bread. So as you go down the baking aisle at your grocery store, start looking, especially if you're new to baking and new to home baking, start looking at the different products that your grocery store sells and what might work really well to help you bake the type of items you want to learn how to bake or that you just want to bake because they're things that you're familiar with. And make sure that you're well stocked with those items. And I want to mention that as long as you have refrigeration or a freezer, packaged yeast, the yeast that you buy at the grocery store, you can buy it in a little bulk package, or you can buy the little tiny packages that usually are just the one-use packages. If you freeze that, or if you refrigerate that, you can extend the shelf life of your packaged yeast. So if you find some on sale and you do have good refrigeration or good freezing, and you have backups, maybe like a little generator for a little electric-powered cooler or something like that in the event that you do lose power, but you can keep your cold foods cold, you can keep that yeast on hand and it will last well past its best-by date, and it'll do great at rising your bread. Now, I want to talk about a bonus item here, and this is very important. I have not included this in the original top 10. And the reason for that is these are foods that I really feel are still affordable. And that's why I'm talking about stocking up on these now. They're still affordable. They're all non-perishable. And they're probably things that are still in stock in your grocery store and are still available for you to be able to buy. The bonus item that I want to talk about are your canned meats, chicken, and fish. Some of these have become extremely expensive. I have seen canned chicken basically double in price. And it's been shocking to me. Canned tuna, I use fun to say because I think you think of tuna all the time when you think of canned proteins. But canned chicken used to be $2 a can in my grocery store. And it's now $4 or even higher. And that's getting pricey. Now, if that's in your budget, I would say it may not be a bad thing to stock up on because it may just go higher in price. There have been problems with chickens, we've all been hearing about in the news, and a lot of chickens had to be disposed of. And so chicken may not necessarily be coming down in price anytime soon. So if you do find canned chicken and it is in your budget, that may be something that you want to consider stocking up on. Canned meats, like if you can find them, I can't even find them. But if you can find like canned roast beef and other canned meats like that, especially maybe at the big box stores where you can buy like 6 cans at once and get a little better price. If it's in your budget, that's definitely something you can consider. But as I said, I can't even find it. It's out of stock anywhere that I try to look. So if you find it and it's in your budget, might be something worth stocking up on. Now, getting to tuna, tuna, yes, it has gone up in price, but I think that canned tuna is still affordable. The cans seem to have gotten quite small, though. Many canned tunas now are only about 5 ounces, which is considered a single serving. But you can do a lot with tuna, and if you can digest it, it's definitely worth thinking about stocking in your working pantry and your extended pantry. And you can cook with canned tuna, and often when you cook canned tuna, it can become easier to digest, or at least that's been my personal experience. And I just recently released a video which I think you'll really enjoy. It's something that was made very often in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and it's called tuna pie. This is the most unusual recipe that I have ever discovered and made. And it's very cute because it's basically like a chicken pot pie, but you don't have to make the crust. I'll tell you what they do instead. But it's basically like a chicken pot pie where you've got the potatoes and the veggies and you make your homemade cream sauce, but you use tuna instead of chicken. And then instead of worrying about a pie crust, you use biscuits. And the recipe for the biscuits was so unusual. You make the biscuits with some cottage cheese. And you can even make your own homemade cottage cheese, which I've shown you how to do. But then, instead of rolling out the dough and trying to cut out the biscuits or even do a drop biscuit, you roll your dough into a log and then you just cut them. I got the biggest kick out of this. It reminded me of those biscuits that they sell at the grocery store, which are not very good for you. There's a lot of chemicals, but you bang it on the counter and it pops open, and then they're like already sliced in the container for you or something like that. And this reminded me of that. You were just rolling this and then you just cut them up and then you just put them on top of the tuna pie. It was delicious. I got to tell you, we inhaled it. My husband's still talking about how good it was. And even my son, which generally he's not been in the past, what's a tuna noodle casserole? That's a popular dish. He wasn't always a huge fan of that. But he's even said this tuna pie was delicious. So I'll definitely link to that. I highly recommend that you try that. And it's so easy, it's so reasonable to make. And what I loved about it is because it was a Depression era recipe and they were stretching their milk, and you could even use your powdered milk that you reconstitute. But under normal circumstances, the recipe would call for 2 cups of milk. But what they recommended in this recipe was save your milk and just use 1 cup of milk and then fill the rest of the way up to 2 cups with the water that you've cooked your potatoes and vegetables in. So I thought that was just wonderful. So you dilute it, and we could not tell the difference that there was just 1 cup of milk used to make the white sauce. So, but in any event, I highly recommend that recipe. But going beyond tuna fish, because that's very common, I highly recommend, and I kind of did allude to this back in the beginning when we were talking about sardines, I highly recommend that you look into considering buying, and just start with 1 can, but that you consider buying some other types of canned fish that maybe you've never tried before. Think of anchovies, think of sardines, and if you're totally new to buying these types of canned fish, try kippers. Kippers are a type of herring. They've been smoked. They're very tasty. I have got to say that pretty much anybody I have introduced to canned fish and have recommended kippers have all liked them. Kippers are very, very tasty. They're also still relatively affordable. But because there are a lot of people who have discovered kippers and like kippers, kippers can be a little hard to find. So if you're at your grocery store and you can still find kippers. Now, I used to get kippers, a can of kippers for 98 cents. And I think the can was bigger than it is today, but in any event. And so I would always, on every grocery shopping trip, I'd buy 1 or 2 cans of kippers. We really enjoy them. Now, they used to be 98 cents. Now, they've gone up in price, and they'll probably continue to go up in price because, it often can be supply and demand. And it's been a while since I've seen kippers in stock, at least at my grocery store. So if you see them in stock at your grocery store, buy 1 or 2 cans of kippers, and then if you find that you like them, then make that a regular thing on your shopping list that say, okay, I'm going to get 2 cans of kippers every week, and I'm going to start stocking those into my working and extended pantry. And the same with sardines. Try 1 or 2. Anchovies are wonderful. They just are salty. To me, they don't really have any kind of fishy flavor. And as I said, you cook them with a little olive oil and then toss your pasta in them. It just gives a lovely flavor. So look at different canned items. Now, there are some canned seafood items that have become very expensive. Clams have risen in price. What's the other one? Oh, it's escaping me right now. But the other one that I do want to talk about that is still affordable, especially if you can shop at Aldi's, and I mentioned this in my Aldi's haul video, canned salmon. Canned salmon is usually wild caught, and it's canned right at the processing plants that are right on the water, like in Alaska when the boats come in. So it's very fresh, it's good quality. I like to buy it that has the bones and the skins intact. The bones, they just dissolve in your mouth, and they're very high in calcium. And the skin contains a lot of nutrients as well. So these are things to look for. What I couldn't think of before was crab. Canned crab is very expensive. The little shrimps, canned shrimps can be very expensive. So those may be things that, at least for now, we necessarily won't be stocking in our working or extended pantries because the price has just escalated so high. But look for your kippers, look for your sardines, look for your anchovies, excuse me, and look for your canned salmon. And I have a recipe where I show you how to make salmon cakes. That if you think, oh, I prefer fresh salmon, and you think you don't like canned salmon, you're going to love these salmon cakes. They're easy to make and they're very affordable, especially if you can find your canned salmon at a good price. So I hope this has really helped you to think about what you need to start stocking up now. Don't forget to download your list here and either print it out or download it to your phone, whatever easiest for you. But don't forget to do that. No email required. Now, if you want to learn more about how to stock your pantry, your Four Corners pantry, your working pantry, your fridge, your freezer, and your extended pantry, how to do it with real food that you can find at the grocery store, and how to do it starting with as little as $5 a week, be sure to click on this video over here where I have a whole playlist on how to stock your pantry, and including your prepper pantry, how to store your food correctly to extend its shelf life, plus a lot of recipes for how to use these foods that we're stocking. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.